That's awesome. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this first talk of the year of our partnership between University of Campinas, the Institute of Computing here, and the Department of Informatics at the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, represented here today by Professor Marcos Endler, director there. This is called Conexão, Rio-Campinas, in Portuguese, Conexão, Rio-Campinas, and it's a series of talks in which we try to bring cutting-edge researchers to discuss timely topics. Let me mute here. So it's a big pleasure to have Dr. Jeff Hawkins with us today. I had the pleasure to attend one of his talks last year at MIT, an event at MIT. And the first thing that I did right after his talk was try to reach him out. And now you need to talk to us. So it's pretty great that he accepted to join us today and tell us a little bit about his theory of intelligence and how that impacts artificial intelligence. This group here is pretty eclectic, but most of the people here are from neuroscience or artificial intelligence background. I've seen that some colleagues from neuroscience just joined it, and a lot of people here from our lab of artificial intelligence here at the Institute of Computing called Recod.ai. So it's a big pleasure to have Dr. Hawkins today. And for those of you who don't know about him, he is the co-founder of the company called Numenta, which is a neuroscience research company. And he is also founder of the Redwood Neuroscience Institute and one of the founders of the field of handheld computing. So you are used today with smartphones, but Dr. Jeff Hawkins here was one of the pioneers in this area. He's also a member of the National Academy of Engineering and author of at least 2 books that I know. One is on intelligence, the other is this one on 1,000 Brains, a new theory of intelligence, which is the subject of today's talk. So welcome, Jeff, and I hand the word to Professor Marcos Endler to also welcome you. He is the director at the Catholic University in Rio, a partner in this series of talks. Professor Marcos, you are on mute.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, and welcome, Professor Jeff Hawkins. We are very delighted to have you giving a talk to us, and I consider you one of the most influential neuroscientists of these times, like the Einstein of neuroscience. Our expectations are very high of your talk. As no, but I'm kidding. I mean, it's very important to have you talking to us, because I think the Brazilian computer science community, which is also working a lot towards artificial intelligence, is eager to hear what you have to say, because your model, the 1,000 brain theory, has some similarities with deep learning, but is also, of course, very specific is our biology, which is different. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon or this day, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Marcos. And so Jeff, without any further delays, I hand to you. Thanks a lot, and please feel free to share your slides and start the presentation.
Great. Well, thank you, Marcus, and thank you, Anderson, for the lovely introduction and for inviting me to come here speak today. It would be lovely if I could be in Brazil with you, but that's not possible these days. I'm going to share my screen and switch over to my presentation, which I think hopefully you'll see that now. Is that right?
It's coming.
Do you see my opening slide? Yes.
Yep.
In my case, not yet.
Yes.
Okay, very good.
Oh, so maybe is you there? You're there. We can get started. Yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, this is interesting. I hope there's a little funny thing happened on my computer, so I hope this is the right version of the presentation, because I see there's a change that it's not here, but we'll just go forward and hope it all works. Yeah, you know, there is as you mentioned, I work at a company called Numenta, and I just make a little, we're a small company. We have about 17 employees, 20 sometimes, you know, depending on interns and visitors, visiting scholars. But 3 of our full-time employees are Brazilian, and one of them actually works remotely in Brazil. So we have our own little Portuguese, you know, communication community in our small company. We didn't intend it to be that way, but I guess Brazil produces a lot of really creative people. So anyway.
Just confirming, Jeff, guys, do you see his slides?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes. Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Yes. Are you seeing him, Anderson?
No, but don't worry. It's a problem with my monitor here.
Okay. All right. Well, I hope everyone can see it, because it won't be much of a presentation if you can't. Right. So as Anderson mentioned, I do have a couple books. The recent one came out this last year, and I'm mentioning it because everything I'm going to talk about today. And so if you're really excited about this, you don't have to worry about taking notes or anything like that. You can always read about it there, but I'll come back to that later. Let me just tell you a little bit about Numenta. Let me just close out, make sure I'm going to stop some extra stuff on my screen here. Let me just see if I can get rid of it. Okay. I'll tell you a little bit about Numenta. We're in Redwood City, California, which is Northern California. We've been around since 2000. We sit at the intersection of neuroscience and computer science, which seems very opportune for what you folks are all working on. We have 2 missions. The first is a biological one, is to reverse engineer the neocortex, to understand how it works. Our goal here is really deep neuroscience. It's to understand biologically accurate and testable theories. We publish in Neuroscience. It's a neuroscience mission. The second mission we have is to take what we've learned about the brain and apply it to AI. And there's 2 ways we're going about that. The first way is we're using some of the things we've learned about the brain to improve current AI techniques, deep learning, CNNs, ANNs, and so on. But we're also working on totally new algorithms or enhanced algorithms to what we think will be the future of AI, machines. So those are our 2 missions. And I'm going to spend the first part of my talk, most of it actually talking about the neuroscience. I'll end my talk talking about the AI portion. My talk is fairly high level. I will get into some details, but I don't want to get into too many. And so if you have people who really want to know the details, they can ask questions in the Q&A section at the end. Okay, so hopefully, why is my screen not progressing here? Okay, there we go. About the brain, this is a line drawing of a human brain. One part of the human brain is the neocortex. It's a sheet of neural tissue. It's about 3 millimeters or 2.5 millimeters thick. It's 1,000 square centimeters in area. It's about the size of a dinner napkin, if you want to think of it that way. And it's a sheet of tissue, but it's folded to fit into your skull. So that's why we have all these crevices and folds in it. But about 70% of the volume of a human brain. And so it really dominates our brain. There's lots of other areas. I call them older because many of them are older, evolutionary-wise older. There's dozens of other specialized brain regions that do various things. They, in total, comprise about 30% of the brain's volume. Some of them are visible, sticking out the bottom, and some of them are inside where the neocortex wraps around them, and you can't see them in this picture. Many of these older brain areas are involved in sort of basic functions, controlling our breathing and digestion and reflex behaviors. Even some behaviors like walking, running, and chewing are really controlled by old brain sections. And most of our emotions are generated in regions that are subcortical, as we say. So there's small regions that will emit chemicals that infuse to the brain and our bodies to create emotional states. The neocortex, on the other hand, is associated with everything we think about intelligence. All perception, if you're aware that you're seeing something or hearing something or touching something, that's going on in the neocortex. All of our language is created and understood there, whether it's spoken language, written language, the language of mathematics, sign language, music, and so on. Pretty much everything we think about is cognition, thought, and planning, and all these sort of academic subjects we think about, engineering, math, science, and literature. These are all the products of the neocortex. They all happen in this set of cells. So one can argue, and I believe that the right way to think about it is the neocortex is the organ of intelligence. And if we understand how it works, we would know how to build machines that work on the same principles and those would undoubtedly be intelligent. So part of my approach to neuroscience is really to understand the brain, but say, well, then what can we learn from the brain that really informs us how to build better intelligent machines? So first, what does the brain do? Oh, excuse me, the neocortex do? You might think it's common to think of it like, oh, it's like a computer, it has some input from the senses, it processes them, and then it does something, it acts. And that's a natural way to think because obviously actions are what define our success or not. But it's really not the right way to think about the neocortex. It's not a computer. It doesn't process inputs and generate outputs directly like that. The right way to think about it is it's a modeling system. And so it learns a model of the world. And that's the way we've come to understand it. And that's the right way to think about it. Now, everything you know about the world, which is quite a lot, everything you know is stored in this model. We know how things look, how things feel, how things sound, how they do these things together. We know where things are located in the world relative to each other. That could be like, where's the library? Where do I keep my clothes in my closet? To, where are the apps on my phone? Things like that. We also know our model includes how things change when we interact with them. So many things have behaviors. So whether it's, how your bicycle behaves, how a car behaves, how do people behave, what happens when I move a stapler and push down on it, and so on. These things all have to be learned, and they're all stored in your head. It's an incredible amount of knowledge that's stored in your head. There's tens of thousands of objects, words, concepts that you know in great detail. And this is all stored in a model in your neocortex. The advantage of having a model is that it allows you not just to recognize objects and know where we are, but it allows us to predict the consequences of our actions. We can think through what would happen if I did this, and what would happen if I went there, and what would I expect to occur if I took this action, and how would I achieve certain goals. So it's really necessary if you're going to do planning and achieve goal-oriented planning, you need to have some sort of model of the world. And ours is very rich, allows us to do that. Now, there's a lot of confusion I find when I talk about models. So I'm going to talk about a brief sidestep here to talk about what do I talk about in models. And I'll come back to the main presentation. Here's a picture of a model. This is a model of a architect would make of a house. And you said, well, why do we make models like this? The point of making a model like this is you can, before you build a house, or you can imagine what the house would look like from different positions. You can imagine, you can ask yourself, well, how would I get from the driveway to the kitchen? What obstacles might I have? How many different pathways could I go to get there? And you can sort of walk through scenarios and seeing what things would look like and how you would interact with this thing. Today, we build models like this often on a computer. So here's a computer's generated a model of a house. We do the same thing. We can look at it from different perspectives, imagine what it would be to be in different locations and how we would interact with it and what would happen. So how do we do this in a computer? In a computer, we want to build a model like this. We would just typically assign a reference frame, like a Cartesian coordinates, an X, Y, and Z reference frame, and we would locate features of the house relative to this reference frame. Interesting, typically what you do, though, the features themselves have their own reference frame. So in this house, there's a garage door here, and it would have its own reference frame. The reference frame would specify where the features of the door's reference frame, and then we can locate the door to the house by specifying where the green reference frame is relative to the blue reference frame. So this is how we do this in computers. And it's going to turn out that the brain does something surprisingly similar, not exactly like this, but it uses, and it's going to use reference frames and different types of reference frames in this, but they're going to use reference frames, and it's going to build models using somewhat similar principles, not exactly like this, but closer than you would imagine, closer than I imagined when I first started this. So this is when I talk about building an internal representation of the structure of something that allows you to manipulate it and look at it from different perspectives and interact with it. And that's what's going on in your head. So let's come back to a presentation here. I contend that intelligence requires learning a model of the world, at least general intelligence does. If I want to have a system that can think broadly or do multiple tasks, interact with the world the way we do, it's going to have a model of the world. And that model has to be updated. The world isn't static. Things are constantly moving. People are going different places. Things are changing their state. New things appearing and disappearing. And so to be an intelligent agent, you have to have most of this model, and you have to update the model continuously as you interact with the world. It's not static. There's no point. You can't really be intelligent in a static world with a static model. So this brings up the question is, well, how does the cortex learn a model of the world? How do neurons do this? It seems kind of crazy to say that it can do, but we know it does. So now we want to start looking at some of the details inside of the brain. On the outside, if you just look at a brain, this is not a real picture. This is another artist's rendition. It looks very uniform. The different parts of the neocortex look very uniform. We know it's divided into functional regions, dozens of them in some sense. So there are regions in the back that are processing vision, and there are regions on the sides, the temporal lobes that process sound. There are some process your touch going across the top of the brain. There are regions that are known to process language on the left temporal lobe. Much of the neocortex is very difficult to define what they do. And even these regions, somatic, sensory, and auditory regions, seem to do multiple things. They're not just totally restricted to those things. So anyway, but on the surface, they all look the same. So that doesn't tell us too much. So what we want to do now is look inside, internally, and inside the neocortex. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to look at this sheet of cells. So here's our two images of slices through the 2.5 millimeter thickness of the cortex. These are made by a very famous neuroscientist, Ramon Cajal. He was one of the first people who was able to actually see the neural structure, the cellular structure of the neocortex, because they had invented just around that time, around the turn of the 20th century, invented techniques for staining cells. And so he looked through the microscope, and these are drawings he drew by hand. He's very famous for these drawings. Every neuroscientist knows Cajal. These two images show two different things. They're both looking at a slice across the neocortex. On the one on the left is showing the cell bodies. This is like the neuron cell bodies, and they're different sizes, somewhat different shapes. They're packed in different densities. And this led to the idea that the neocortex is composed of layers of cells. And they 6 layers back then. We now know that's not really true. There's many more layers than 6, but we still use the 6-layer nomenclature. The other drawing to the right shows some of the connections between the cells, the dendrites and the axons. And one of the things you might pick up from this is that most of the connections in the neocortex go, in this picture, vertically between the layers. So information goes up and down between the layers, and there's some cellular layers that send information long distances horizontally, but most processing occurs vertically. Over the last 120 years, papers published on the anatomy and the physiology of the neocortex. It's extremely well studied. It is extremely complex, and it's very difficult to summarize, but I'm going to give you some high-level observations. This is the kind of drawing that we make. I made this drawing where we're trying to understand the flow of information, the different types of information that's being passed around between the layers, and trying to tease apart what their computational properties are. A couple of high-level observations. The neocortex, you see basically the same circuitry. These images on the left, I didn't tell you what part of the neocortex they came from because they're kind of universal. In fact, I didn't have to tell you what animal they came from. It's very similar across species and across different regions. It's not identical, but it's very similar. So you see the same types of neurons. We see them organized in the same types of layers. We've seen the same types of connections between these layers. A couple other observations. It's every cortical column, as far as we know, has a motor output. Part of the region, I should say. Every part of the cortex have a motor output. And that's labeled here on the green arrow exiting to the right. And so even parts of the cortex that get input from the eyes, for example. You think they're just processing vision data, but they also project back to the part of the brain that moves the eyes. And therefore, there is the circuitry involves both sensation and motor. They're both sensory motor regions. This is pretty much common everywhere in the neocortex. Now, not every part of the neocortex gets sensory data, but the parts that don't get input from other regions, which could be considered a type of sensory data. But as far as we know, every region has a motor output. So that's a very interesting observation. Now, what else can we say about this? So the question is, well, first question we could ask is, well, how is it possible the neocortex looks similar everywhere? How is it possible we have the same detailed circuitry? This is not, some blob of neurons. It's extremely detailed, complex circuitry. And how is it possible it looks similar everywhere? It doesn't seem like it would be. You'd think that the areas that are doing vision would look like different than the areas doing language, which look like they're different than the areas that we use for mathematics. That doesn't seem to be the case. So the first person to make sense of this was Vernon Mountcastle. He was a neurophysiologist at Johns Hopkins University, and he published some very influential papers about the neocortex. And he was one of the first people to argue the following points. He said, well, the reason the different areas of the neocortex look the same is because they perform the same intrinsic function, that they're all doing the same thing. He says what makes them different is what they're connected to. So if you take a region of cortex and you hook it up to the eyes, you get vision. And if you took the same region of cortex, hook up to the ears, you get hearing, and so on. There's a lot of evidence supporting this theory now. Simple is to do that, although that experiment has been done on neonatal ferrets. They did that. But that's the big idea. And it's like, wow, what a crazy, interesting idea. There's a common algorithm that's being underlying everything that the neocortex does. He made the second point, which is that the human neocortex got large. Remember, it's a large part of our brain, not by growing bigger, but by copying a unit. Basically, it says it just made more common. And the term used is the cortical column. So a cortical column is approximately a millimeter square. In a human, there'd be approximately 150,000 of them. And each one spans through the surface, through all the layers of the neocortex, and has about 100,000 neurons per column. Here's an image which is, you wouldn't see this, but this helps you illustrate it. Here you can imagine looking at the neocortex from the side, and you see, since in each of these little columns is like a millimeter square in area. Again, you don't see this if you look at a microscope. The columns are not visible, but he made the argument that they're there. And I'm just going to delve a little bit into how and why he made this proposal. So here's an image from one of his papers. In this image, he's showing 6 cortical columns connected to the hand of the skin of a monkey's hand. And so the point here is that these columns are labeled 1 through 6 above, and each one is getting input from a different patch of the skin. And so if you stuck a probe through the cortex at an angle, which is represented by the diagonal line, it first enters this column 1. And in that area, all the cells seem to be responding to the same patch of skin. And then abruptly, it changes when you go to column 2. They change to a different patch of skin. It may be adjacent and slightly overlapping, but it's an abrupt change. And so it's as if 1 millimeter of cortex is processing in from one patch, and the next millimeter of cortex is processing it from a different patch. And he's found this organization throughout as far as everywhere we've looked, we found it throughout the neocortex. So that's where the idea that these cortical columns exist. It's really a connectivity and a functional description of what they found. Now, there's a lot of contention about in the neuroscience community is whether, are these the same or are they different? And because some people would like to think that, well, language is really different. It has to have different things. And other people say this has to be different and so on. So here's a little scale. If I said on the scale of everything on the left is completely different, that is different parts of the cortex would be completely different. And on the right, every part of the cortex is completely identically the same. I would put the dividing line about here. I would say about 90% of what we find in every part of the cortex across different species is going to be the same. And there's maybe a 10%. And so our goal is to not worry about the variation, which could be like there's more of these cells, or there's more of those cells, or the cells are bigger, and so on. let's look about the common component. There's a complex circuitry. It's common everywhere. We want to understand what that complex circuitry is. So now our question becomes, what does a cortical column do? We know the neocortex builds a model of the world. We know that model is very complicated. We know the different parts of the cortex are getting input from different places, but they're all built on this cortical column. So if we understand this, we would know a lot about how the entire cortex works. So I'm going to stop sharing right now if I can. Hopefully you'll see me. There we go. You don't want to see that. There's some craziness on my computer. So one day I did this thought experiment. I just thought I'd share it with you directly. So this is one of my coffee cups. It's the Numenta coffee cup. And I was touching it with my finger. And I was saying, well, of course, I have a model of this coffee cup in my head. I know what it feels like, and I know what it looks like. And as I move my finger over the coffee cup, even if I'm not looking at it, I predict what I'm going to feel. I'm going to feel this handle. I'm going to feel the rounded edge. I'm going to feel the rough, unglazed part on the bottom. And I said, well, I have to have a model of the coffee cup to make those predictions. I know in advance what I'm going to feel when I'm moving my fingers. I'm moving finger to here to here. I can imagine I'm going to feel this rounded edge. But what else does my brain need to know? It needs to know where my finger is relative to the coffee cup or the coffee cup. And that means my brain has to have some representation of the location of my finger relative to the coffee cup, so that as I move it, it knows where it's going to be and what it can predict, what it's going to feel. This is an interesting idea that somehow the brain is keeping an idea where my finger is in a reference frame that's anchored to the cup. And not only that, but if I touch the cup with all different parts of my skin, each part of my skin is making similar predictions. So the brain is keeping track of the parts of my skin relative to this coffee cup. And that was, I had this realization a number of years ago, and it really sort of opened up thinking about how the neocortex works. So I'm now going to go back to sharing my screen again, and I'll pick up again where I left off. Okay, let's see here. Hopefully this is going to work, and I have to get rid of this little floating control again. You don't see it, but I do. All right, so this brings us what we call the 1,000 brains theory. And first part of 1,000 brains theory is the following. It says every column in this 100,000 neurons, and you've got 150,000 of these in your brain, each one is learning models of the world by integrating sensory input and movement over time. So imagine in this image here, I show the tip of my finger touching the coffee cup. There's some sensory feature that's coming in from the tip of the finger. That's not very useful on its own, but there's another thing coming into the column. This is true too, is that there's some sense of how the finger is moving. This column that's getting this input knows how the finger is moving. And it uses that information to update a reference frame, which represents the location of my finger on the coffee cup. And so as I move, it changes that location, and then it pairs the sensation with the location. Now, this is a highly simplified version of what's actually going on, but I think it conveys correctly the basic idea. It's more complicated than this, but I wanted to get the essence of it across. So the idea is that you have a sensation, you're pairing it with the location, and as your finger moves, you have a series of these representations going on in the cortical column. The column isn't just a static thing; it's getting a time series of inputs and locations and inputs locations based on the movement of my finger. And that comprises a model of the object. Obviously, if I could learn where all the features of the coffee cup are relative in a reference frame to the coffee cup, we then said that, okay, well, there's going to be another layer of cells, which I'm labeling here the object. It's the object ID. This is going to be a layer of cells that represents the actual thing that I'm touching. So if this was the coffee cup, you might imagine being a representation of the coffee cup. It's going to be stable, meaning that cells are not going to be changing their activation states as I move my finger because the object I'm touching is stable. It's not like the coffee cup is still the coffee cup, even though I'm moving my fingers of it. So we can associate a set of features at locations with a common representation for that object. And that then defines a model of the object. A model of the object is given an ID, and it has a set of locations and features associated with it in its basic form. Now, the next question we can ask is, well, we have many of these columns going on at the same time. So imagine I'm touching the coffee cup with 3 fingers at once. Each finger has a different location in the coffee cup. Each finger is a column. Each column is trying to learn a model of the coffee cup. And maybe let's say each finger has learned to model the coffee cup. And so now each finger is sending an input to each of these 3 different columns. If I already knew the coffee cup and I already had 3 models of the coffee cup, one in column 1, one in column 2, and one in column 3, then each of these columns would be getting one sensation, but that sensation from one finger typically wouldn't recognize the object. If I just touch an object with one finger at one time, I don't know what object I'm touching. Usually one touch isn't sufficient. But often if I grab it with my whole hand, I can see it in one sensation. So what we believe is going on is what we call voting. And the idea here is that in the neocortex, there are many, many models of objects that we know. It's not that every part of the cortex knows every object, knows everything, but there are many models of your coffee cup. And in fact, there are going to be lots of models, in different parts of your skin that are representing the same types of things. And what they do is they vote to reach a consensus. So I'll give you some illustrations in this moment, but each one says, it's sort of like each column is saying, I have a lot of uncertainty what I might be sensing right now, but together we can reach a consensus what's the only thing which is consistent with us. And therefore, very often you can recognize something with a single grasp, but if you had to touch it with one finger, you have to move your finger to infer what the object was. The same thing is going on in vision, and vision is very confusing to people because people think that vision is like, oh, we get this image coming into your head and we process the image. That's not what neuroscience tells us. It's not like that at all. Vision is very analogous to touch. You can think about the back of the retina is a series of sensor patches, each one projecting to a different cortical column, just like we talked about with the fingers and the skin. And so nobody's looking at the entire image. It's as if each cortical column is looking at a little slice of the world, like it's looking through a straw, it can see only a little bit. And so you can really do this experiment yourself. You can look at the world through a straw. You can restrict your visual input to a very small patch of your retina. And then to learn or infer, you have to move that straw around. And you can do this. You can learn what new objects look like. You can infer them by movement in the same way you would have to do with one finger. But when you let all the columns see the input at the same time, they can vote and reach a consensus. Not always, but often. They can reach a consensus in one flash. Sometimes you have to move your eyes a bit to do that, but often you can do it in one inference step. So these are some of the 2 key premises of the Thousand Brains series, that we have all these different columns that are integrating movement and sensory over time. Each one is learning models of the world, and there are many models of every object, and they're voting to reach consensus. It's worth pointing out again that the object ID layer, the thing that's representing what you sense, is going to be stable as long as it's stable in the world. So as I look at something, my eyes are constantly moving about 3 times a second, everyone's eyes. You're generally not aware of it. Your perception of the world is stable, even though the inputs are completely changing. It's not like they're sliding around. No, they're completely changing, and yet you still see the world as stable. And what's going on here is you have this pooling layer, I call it, on the object layer. So the inputs are changing, the locations are changing, but the columns are continually voting and saying, yeah, we're all seeing the same thing. It's still a coffee cup, even if my eyes are already in that way. You see the same thing with touch. I will grab an object, even if I move my fingers over, I may be aware that I'm moving my fingers, but the perception of the object is just that it's stable. It's not moving, even though sensations on my skin are changing rapidly. We've done a lot of work with this. I'm going to show you a little simulation we did. It's more of a cartoon simulation, but we actually built this stuff and it really does work. This will help you illustrate what I just talked about. So this is, imagine a little robot arm, and here we're showing on the left part of a cortical column where you have a representation of the input and the output, which is the object ID. So imagine now that this finger moves towards the cup. It has some location on the cup. Let's assume for the moment we know what the location is. We get some sensory feature. We form a representation in a particular neural way we've written about, but I'm not going to describe here, which is that feature at that location. And that immediately leads to a prediction of what kind of object might I be touching. And the way that we think this is happening in the brain, to a little detail, it forms these unions of these representations. It's not going through them serially. It doesn't in parallel. And so it says, look, there's a lot of things this could be. Maybe in this case, it could be this cup, it could be a can, it could be a tennis ball. I can't tell what it is. You make a movement to a new location, you get a new sensory input, and now this new input is inconsistent with one of those interpretations. So we start narrowing down what you might be touching until we get rid of the tennis ball, but it still could be the can or the cup. And you do another sensation, you get another feature, and now that's inconsistent with the can, and so now you know exactly what it is. So in 3 touches, you've identified what this is. Same thing here again. The illustration doing this with multiple fingers at the same time is the hand. We have hand graphs. We get 3 different inputs, 3 different locations on the cup. There's still confusion. Every column has multiple hypotheses. We're just showing 2 here. And so no one can know, but when they vote, there's only one that's consistent across all the columns. And then you settle on the answer quickly. It's a method for faster inference. Okay, we did some more complex simulations. We used this 80 object benchmark we can get from Yale. It's called the Yale CMU Berkeley object benchmark. We built a robotic hand. I won't go through the details of this, where it sensed these objects, and we put sensors on them. And for those of you who don't recognize this kind of image, I'll just briefly explain what it is. This is just basically showing you, when it touches something, when this robot touches something, how accurately did it infer correct what object it was? Right answer is the yellow diagonal line. Anything that's off the yellow line is not an error, it's just confusing. It means that there wasn't enough information to decide between objects. And so that was 1 touch. If we then do a second touch, we narrow it down broadly. If we do 6 touches, we're almost perfect. And if we do 10 touches, we do have it perfect. This is very much like what you do when you touch something. If I would ask you to move your hand into a black box to sense something, sometimes you'd be able to get it in a few touches. Sometimes it'd take you several more, but after a number of touches, you'll definitely get it. I'm going to skip that. Yes, this is an older version of this presentation. I don't know how that happened. I'm going to skip that slide. The next question we had is, okay, we're proposing that there are these locations and these reference frames in the cortical column. And that's an interesting question. How could that be? Well, how can neurons represent these cells? They're not simple cells. Cells represent a reference frame. They don't do math. They're not going to do, the coordinate geometry or something like that. How do they do that? And we deduced that they must exist. And we said they must exist in cortical columns. So fortunately, there's another older part of the brain called the hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex. This part of the brain is known to represent learn maps of environments. It was first learned by doing it with rats in boxes. So that's an image here showing rats in boxes. And there's these 2 types of cells. There's a bunch of cells in the entorhinal cortex and hippocampus called place cells and grid cells. And they are implicit in how these environments are learned. And grid cells in particular are known to create a reference frame of environments. Nobel Prizes were given out for the teams that discovered these cells. And this is a very highly studied field. But grid cells are an example of a type of reference frame. So we made the following speculation. We said, look, it's probably what's going on is that the evolution discovered a method for learning environments. And by the way, humans have place cells and grid cells too. And we needed this to learn how to get around in the world. But then it said, I can use the same algorithm, evolution discovered, you can use the same basic algorithm for learning other things. So when you move your finger over a coffee cup, it's analogous to the rat moving in the room. And you're moving a sensoring organ around some environment, and you're building up of it as you do that. So we said, look, we think cortical columns are using the same mechanisms as grid cells and place cells, which exist in another part of the brain. And we made this proposal back in 2017. And that was a pretty speculative proposal because no one was thinking at that time that grid cells and place cells would exist in the cortex. I don't think many people were thinking at all that there would be reference frames in the cortex. But so we made that prediction. And it's turned out to be, we went further than that. We said their columns have all these different types of cells that we see in the old parts of the brain. Now, it turns out that there's now a lot of evidence supporting this hypothesis. I'm not going to go through the details of these experiments. They're very complicated. But these images come from an experiment that was done using humans in an fMRI imaging machine. And these humans were asked to think about birds and different types of birds. And the imaging machine was detecting neural activity in their prefrontal cortex while they were doing this. And I won't try to explain how they figured this out, but it's very clever. They were able to show that very high likelihood that there are grid cells in the prefrontal cortex, and that those grid cells are actually creating a type of reference frame to describe the attributes of the birds. So this is very direct evidence in prefrontal cortex of using grid cells to make maps of things such as birds. Other papers came out which were showing similar discoveries of grid cells in place cells and other cells in other parts of the neocortex. This is from a paper showing in the somatosensory cortex, which is where your touch is. Again, very complex experiment. I won't try to explain it. But this is basically saying in the cortical columns that are getting input from your skin, like I was talking about earlier when your finger's touching the cup, they've evidence of grid cells and place cells equivalent, things that act like them in those regions. So this gave us, this is not definitive. This doesn't prove this is going on everywhere in the cortex, but we still think it does. And we think this is certainly very strong evidence that the hypothesis is correct, that these models are built using reference frames, using grid cells. Okay, I'm now going to switch to the latter part of my talk, which is, the implications of AI machine intelligence. And I hope I have the right slides here because I seem to be using the wrong, I seem to have the wrong version of this. Okay, well, we're going to see. We're going to have to wing it. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. All right, so the next question is, what does 1,000 brains theory tell us about machine intelligence? What do we learn from the brain that we can use going forward? The number one thing I would say is that intelligent machines need to learn to model the world. This is, I'm going to just, I hope you bear with me for a second. I want to see if I can find my other presentation, the correct one that I should be using here, because I know I made a lot of modifications to this. Let's try this one here. Hope you guys don't mind putting up with this for a second. I think, let's try this, see if that's better. Yeah, I think this is going to be the right one. My mistake, I apologize. So again, let's review here. The question is now, how do we build truly intelligent machines? This is going back to my point that we've now switched to the second part of my talk. How do we build truly intelligent machines, and what do we learn by studying the brain? So these are my new slides. To have general intelligence, I argue machines need to learn a detailed model of the world. And today's AI doesn't do this. We say that today's AI systems have a model. You might say a computer neural network that plays chess has a model of the chess game. You could say that, but it's a very limited model. It says basically giving a chessboard, state, and what should my next move be. But that neural network wouldn't have any knowledge about chessboards or about chess pieces, how it might fall over, about human players, about the history of the game. It wouldn't have any knowledge. We have to take a break so the other player can go to the bathroom. Nothing. It's really it's the most basic model. And just like all I know is what move to make in a chess game. And that's pretty much, even today's very sophisticated language models such as G3 and so on, they really have no understanding of what to do. They're statistical methods in some sense, but there's no underlying model. But to have general intelligence, to have machines that do the kind of things that humans can do and solve the kind of problems we can solve, and to generalize across different problem states, you have to have a model, a more detailed model of the world, a more structured model of the world. And we don't have that today. So my first contention is, this is what brains do, and I think truly intelligent machines will have to have this as well. The second thing we've learned is that to learn a model of the world requires sensory motor learning, that it requires that you move through the world, you move your senses relative to the world. This is patently obvious if you think about humans. You can't learn about most of the world unless you experience it. If you go pick things up and move and turn it around and so on. This is what a child does when it's young. It just starts picking things up and moving and experiencing them. Of course, we can learn things through language. We can learn things through reading, but that's not how we acquire most of our knowledge. Most of our knowledge requires actively interacting with the world. One of the advantages is it allows unsupervised learning. You don't have to tell the system what learning, it just learns by building these models. It just figures out how the world is structured through movement. And finally, it's very interesting because it unites the fields of AI and robotics. Moving your sensors through the world is one step away from having a robotic arm that moves it. It's like you can't really separate out movement and sensation in inference and when it comes to brains. Now, what I'm not arguing that all machines in the future are going to be robots and robotic appendages or anything like that. But the principles of sensory motor learning are going to be, I'm arguing, are going to be important. They're going to be essential. Even if I have a system that doesn't look like it's physically embodied, but it's going to be using those same principles to learn. And that's the claim I'm making about that. And then finally, intelligent machines model will be distributed among many nearly identical learning modules. This is the 1,000 brains theory. This is that we have all these columns going in our head. That might not be obvious why you need this, but there's some really big advantages to this. First of all, it provides a very clean way of fusing different sensory inputs, all different types of sensory inputs, because they all work on the same principle, and therefore they can all communicate with each other. All mammals have a neocortex. We have different sets of sensors. Humans, our primary sensors are touch, vision, and hearing. Bats have sonar. Rats have another type of sense called whisking, where their whiskers are active sensors. They move them, and they, in the same way as you move your fingers and hands. And there's lots of different varieties in the animal kingdom, but they're all fit into the neocortex, and they all work on the same principles. So it makes it very easy to integrate different types of sensors into different systems, and they all communicate with each other. They can all talk to each other and end up doing the right thing. It also makes the system very robust. If you think about it, whoops, sorry, got ahead there. We often deal with very impoverished data. We might be working in a very dark environment. You're getting up in the middle of the night, or your view is obscured, or you really can't reach something to touch it, or maybe the sounds are muffled. And we are able to use these models together to basically solve problems that you really couldn't do unless you had lots of models looking at different parts of the world and from different perspectives, different modalities. So it gives us this high robustness to errors. I mean, like you can have a stroke and knock out part of your brain. You might lose a sensory modality, but you're still going to understand the world. You still can get around. People survive very well without vision or without hearing. Helen Keller did without both, and she was very intelligent. And then finally, this idea of the cortical column and that they're distributed models, it gives us an idea for how we could build scalable systems. As I mentioned earlier, all mammals have a neocortex. They're all built of cortical columns, as far as we know. They're just different numbers of cortical columns, and they're attached to different things. So a mouse's brain works on the same principles as a rat's brain, which works on the same principles as a cat's neocortex, or a dog's neocortex, or a monkey's neocortex, and a human neocortex. So when we think about the future of AI, we have the similar scalability between size and modalities. And there's no reasons why I can see why we can't make equivalent systems, machine systems that are much more powerful than humans. So how do we translate this into tangible work? So inside of Numenta, we created a roadmap, a technology roadmap to implement these different principles. Our approach was to start with today's AI system, to start with artificial neural networks, ANNs, and add features to them incrementally, working our way towards the full implementation of what we think will be intelligent machines. We started with two things I haven't even talked about at all, so they weren't important to the first part of my talk, but I'll have to mention them now. On the left, we see sparsity. It turns out in the brain, there's all these neurons. Very few of them are active at any point in time. That means there's a sparse activation. And very few of them, if I have two populations of neurons are talking to each other, very few of them actually connect to each other. That's called a sparse connectivity. This is a direct opposed to the way today's neural networks work, which are generally fully active and fully sparse, fully connected between layers. So there's a lot of clever things that can happen if you make neural networks sparse. It's tricky. It's not so easy to do, but we've been able to show that we can take existing problems, existing networks, and by introducing both sparse activations and sparse connectivity, we can make them anywhere between 5 and 100 times. Much of this work has been published. We're now working on proof that we can do this on any kind of processor. We can show similar gains on CPUs and GPUs and FPGAs. That hasn't been published yet, but we're very confident of that. And sparsity has some other benefits too. It can really make the networks more robust to noise and adversarial attacks. In some sense, it breaks, you can think of it almost like breaks the network into multiple networks that are working simultaneously. Anyway, this is people working on sparsity. This is a hot field, a hot area right now in neural networks. I believe we have world-class, if maybe uniquely so, techniques and performance that we've achieved here because we understand sparsity extremely well from our work in neuroscience. The second thing that we've done is we've introduced a new type of model neuron. Almost all artificial neural networks today use what's called a point neuron. It's a very simple model of a neuron. It's a cell body with a bunch of inputs that get summed and put through some function. But real neurons are much more complex than this. And the first level of complexity comes in the fact that real neurons have these dendritic branches, which contain where all the neurons are. All the synapses are. None of the connections are actually on the cell body. They're on these dendrites. And what it means is that a neuron actually processes, it can recognize dozens or hundreds of patterns independently in one. And there's a lot of advantages to this. So one of the biggest things is we've shown that you can really achieve more continuous learning. ANN suffer from the fact that if you try to train an ANN, take an existing ANN and try to teach something new, it tends to forget other things it learned. And we don't want that. And by using these compartmentalized dendritic compartments on neurons, we're able to show that you can learn new patterns without disrupting existing memory. And it also we showed that it can require far less labeled data to learn. So that's the second thing we've done. We're now working on reference frames. This work has not been published yet, but we're in the middle of it. And the advantages we hope to achieve here, it really gets us to much more invariant representations that it allow you to recognize objects from completely different perspectives and viewpoints, and it allows us to generalize. Now we'll have models of the objects that you can use for comparison between the different models. And it also allows compositional structure. This is the idea that I mentioned, going back to the model of the house I showed earlier, where there was a garage door which had its own reference frame relative to the house. That's an example of compositional structure. And our models of the world are like that. So we need to be able to assign reference frames to reference frames in the brain to build models of the world. So all this comes with reference frames. And then finally, we'd like to implement the full cortical algorithm and with voting. And we're starting on this too. We have a fairly decent sized team working on it right now, where we're achieving a number of things: multi-sensor fusion, as I mentioned earlier, the ability to mix and match sensors almost seamlessly. It'll allow us to achieve scalable AI, because if we can example here, where if we really nail down the cortical column equivalent, this learning module, the sensory learning module, then we can build systems of any different size by adding more or less of them, either in different modalities, sensory modalities, or in a hierarchical form. And it's interesting here too, is that I believe in the future that fields of AI and robotics will be united. They won't be two separate fields like they are today. And so when you have this full model where each model is controlling movement and understands movement, then you have the foundation for building robotic systems, thus as we see it in the animal kingdom. And so we think that's going to be another benefit of this theory. I'm done with my talk. Here's my email address. Welcome to contact me. You can find our papers, a list of them annotated on our website, numenta.com/papers. I have many, I can't list them all. We work as a team. Perhaps my closest collaborator is Subhatoy Ahmad, who runs all of our research, and he and I have been working together for 15 years or so. I always want to thank them all. I'll mention again that if you wanted to read a more expanded version of this talk, I would say more expanded, not technically perhaps, but more in terms of the implications of the theory, where I think AI is going, even its impact on humanity, you look at 1,000 brains to do that. So with that, I am done speaking, and I don't know how much time I took here. We'll see.
Don't worry. Thank you very much, Jeff. It was awesome. I have some pretty interesting questions here, and I'll try to select some as we have some time until 7:20. So I will start with one question that I was thinking about when you presented the theory of the columns, and then you mentioned something like the adaptation of the brain after a stroke. So do you have something to say as how is the process of adaptation when someone gets in an accident and there is a new remodeling of the brain, and how it affects the columns? Are they like redundant so that the person can readapt easily? How do you think it goes?
Things to that answer, Anderson. One is you can have damage and still be functional because I don't like the word redundant, but they're complementary models. So if I lost some of them, I still have other ones, and I can infer the object through touch. I can infer it through vision. So if I lose one of them, I still know what the object looks like. That's one type of thing that I would say these complementary models that means we're not dependent on a distributed modeling system. The other way is interesting. When there's damage to the brain, it rewires itself. In fact, the brain is rewiring itself all the time. So imagine that image I showed from Mountcastle where he showed the hand and there was a bunch of sensory patches and then they went to columns in the cortex. What appears to happen, if you lost some of those columns in the cortex, not too many, if you lose too many, you're in trouble, but if you lose some of them, what will happen is the inputs from the sensors will reroute and redistribute themselves. There's a competitive process that's always going on. It never stops, where these columns are competing in some sense for input, and so if all of a sudden there's some columns that are not or dead, and then the neighboring columns would say, I can use that input, I'll take it, and then it kind of moves over, it kind of rewires, and the next one over here rewires. You typically see after a trauma, an injury, there's about a 4-month period where the brain is just rewiring itself as best it can to accommodate the loss. Obviously, if you have a very large damage to some part of the cortex, you're not going to be able to recover all the functionality. But actually, you can do pretty well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. The capacity of adaptation of the brain is one of the things that I admire most. And machine learning models, they are pretty far away of that. Once you have a trained model to adapt it, it's quite complicated. Very good.
Yeah, that's true.
I have one other question here from Marcos Mota, and I would like to complement that. So how the 1,000 brains theory explains when your brain models are wrong, for example, under illusions or cognitive biases?
Well, okay, first of all, the brain is just a model, right? And models are not the real thing. So they're always going to be wrong to some extent. They'll be wrong mostly for what they don't know, right? So imagine I was colorblind and I learned to see the world through vision, but I don't see colors. Well, I guess you could argue my model is wrong. But it's really just not as detailed as a model that it could be, but it's not really wrong. So I want to point out that we model the part of the world we can sense, and there's parts of the world we can't sense and we can't model them. And so there's always going to be some part of the world we don't understand or we don't perceive or we don't know what's going on. But I think the question was probably more along the lines of what if the model is just wrong? It's just incorrect. And I wrote about this in my book at quite length. I wrote about how we form false models, ones that don't correspond to the world. And this is really easy to do. So let me explain how the brain tests its models. The brain tests its models through prediction. So the brain is constantly predicting the next inputs everywhere, on your fingers, your ears, your eyes. It's just constantly predicting. It says, my model says you should see this, you should hear that, you should feel this. And if there's ever an incorrect prediction, it says, that's something wrong with my model, I'm going to have to attend to that thing and figure out what it is that's wrong. And so if my coffee cup one day felt like it had a square edge on it, I say, wow, what's wrong with that? And I say, oh, look, it's square now. The problem is so much of what we learn as humans, we don't directly sense anymore. We only sense indirectly through other humans, through writing, through video. And so it is really easy to create false models. An example I give is like, I've never been to the city of Havana. Well, I've bet about it. I've never been to the city of Sao Paulo or Rio, right? I believe they're there. How do I, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's false. Maybe the world is just, I don't really know they're there. How would I know? Unless I go there myself, I can't really know, So I just have to trust other people. Well, and that means I have a set of sources that are consistently saying the same thing, and then I believe it. If my set of sources are restricted to people who are not saying the correct thing, I won't know the difference. There's no way to know that Rio really is there if everyone was conspiring to tell me it's not there, or it is there, but it's not. So this is a real problem for humans. We have gotten ourselves in a real pickle right now because there's a lot of false beliefs, and we know the way of getting around it. The way of getting around it is to seek out contrary evidence, seek out places where our predictions are wrong, and that's the scientific method. But most people don't practice the scientific method.
I have a question from my colleague in Recod.ai, Professor Eduardo Valle. I'm curious on how this model of cognition relates to predictive coding. Is it orthogonal? Does one reinforce the other, contradict the other? What do you have to say?
There's some similarities with predictive coding, but I tend to think there's fewer similarities than it first appears. Predictive coding bases on the idea that we pass the errors of our predictions up the hierarchy, right, or from region to region. You're passing predictive error is the thing you want to pass, and that's not how the thousand brain theory works. In the thousand brain theory, prediction is a training mechanism. It tells you, like, if you have an incorrect prediction, I have to update my model. But we don't want to pass the errors. And since we want to pass the object knowledge, the stable representations. So they both have the word prediction in them. They both make predictions. They both detect errors in predictions, but they're used quite differently. So I think it's misleading to think that they're similar.
Just complementing this question, how would you say that these theories are compatible or support each other, the predictive coding and the thousand brains? How do you see their relation?
Okay, so I'll be very honest. I'm not an expert in predictive coding. I'm more of an expert in neuroscience. Obviously, I've read predictive coding papers, but I don't want to pretend I'm current with the state of the art in that field. I'm not. What I have as a neuroscientist, and I'm trying to understand, I read those papers and say, oh, what can I learn from them that helps me understand how the brain works, right? That's my perspective when I read a paper about predictive coding. Mm-hmm. It's not a machine learning problem to me, it's a neuroscience problem. And what I found is that most of the ideas in predictive coding were not helpful, or they violated principles that I thought were true in the brain. So a long time ago, it's not that it's not a great theory or it's not important or it's not valuable, but a long time ago, I said, the brain works like this at all. So that's as far as I'm going to go. I'm not a machine learning expert who can talk about predictive coding versus other types of, in detail where the state of the art is. I just don't know that.
Okay, thank you. I have a question now from Marcelo Romanucci. Thanks for the inspiring presentation. Wondering if you could elaborate on the findings related to the distal synapses, testing the neuron but not triggering it, and how these findings are being incorporated in the existing AI models.
Yeah, all right. So I kind of alluded to that question. So I'll just be a little more explicit here. In fact, we wrote a paper about this it's called Why Do Neurons Have Thousands of Synapses? That's the title of the paper. It's done extremely well. It's the #1 rated paper in its journal. It's highly cited. And we propose a theory about these distal dendrites. So essentially what we think about is a neuron. You get a bunch of inputs, it sums those inputs, and under some function makes the neuron fire. But for about 95% of the synapses, that's not true. They're not able to make the cell fire. What do? They're on these distal, meaning distant dendrites. And the theory we propose, which is backed by a huge amount of scientific biological evidence, is that these sections of the dendrite, like the old branches of the tree, are each doing pattern recognition. That's actually known. They generate what's called a dendritic spike to the soma, the cell body, but it's not sufficient to make the cell spike. So what is it? What we've proposed is that what it leads to is a depolarization, the change in the voltage of the cell body, that is almost enough to make the cell spike, but not. So this is all empirical data. We propose that a mechanism of how that manifests itself in neural circuits. What it basically does, it's a form of prediction that most of the synapses on a cell are predicting the cell should become active, and it depolarizes the cell. And so if that cell does become active, if that prediction comes true, the cell will spike a little bit sooner than other cells that weren't depolarized. And so it's a sense of saying, like, I have predictions, and I'm only going to let the predictions, the correctly predictions are going to dominate the activity. So it's a complex theory, but it's really cool how it works. And I would recommend reading that paper, Why Neurons Have Thousands of Synapses. It goes into detail about it. And since a lot of empirical evidence supporting that theory as well.
Very good. Do you have something to say on how this theory relates to more abstract thinking, such as mathematics, physics, the more complex things that you learn?
Yeah. So this is it's been a very puzzling idea. I mean, you basically say, if you accept what Mountcastle said, and you look at the neuroscience and say, yeah, it looks like these columns are doing all these things. Well, how does that explain, conceptual mathematics and things like that? So it was kind of puzzling. I wrote a whole chapter about this on my book, The Thousand Brains, because I really want to take a stab at this. And so what I argued there is that we learn knowledge about things such as mathematics in the same way we learn knowledge about coffee cups. We define a reference frame, we assign observations to those reference frames, and what you're doing when you're thinking about something, when you're mentally walking through various scenarios, it's like walking through your house. You're essentially moving through locations to locations in these reference frames and recalling what you've stored there. And you're trying to reach a goal, which is a location in this reference frame. You're trying to figure the right path and actions to take to get you there. So you can map on the different components of sensory motor learning onto a model of knowledge of any type that is consisting of reference frames, movements, and locations. And I give several examples of this in my book about how you can think about this. And I think it's actually right. And so in some sense, thinking about anything is a form of movement. You're not physically moving, but you're still moving through space. You're moving through a reference frame space. You're saying, I'm going from this location to this location, recalling what I've stored there. And then you can say an expert is someone who has learned the correct reference frame for any particular topic. It's easy just to say, here's a list of facts. The hard part is organizing in a reference frame that is actionable. And we've conformed. I gave an example for history. You can take the same historical facts, arrange them on a timeline, which is one reference frame, and you can arrange it on a map, which is a different reference frame, and you end up with different understandings of the historical facts and different predictions about them. And so when we learn mathematics, we're also trying to figure out how to organize this knowledge in some reference frame that's actionable. And some of us are better than that than others. I'm not particularly good at math. I'm okay, but not great. So I take a stab at that in the book. Summary of it here.
Very good. I have 3 more questions here, or 4, if we have time. Okay. Professor Esther Colombini, who works with robotics at our institute, is asking, do other parts of the brain relate to emotion drives and more primary needs influence motor learning, or do they interact for decision-making? Could we have human-like intelligent machines without a limbic system, for instance?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And there's a lot of, I know there's a lot of different opinions about this. So I'll give you my take on it. First of all, to be like a human, really like a human, like, like you and I can talk about things, have a beer and sit around and chat, whatever, right? We have to have shared experiences, and those experiences include our emotional states and what it means to feel like being a human, and our drives for whatever we want to achieve as a human, with all the emotional baggage that comes along with that. But you can have I believe, very intelligent machines, they do not have any of those emotional states. You might think of them as like Dr. Spock on Star Trek or something like that. I'm not a science fiction fan, but that I think works. It's you can have this model of the world that is intrinsically separated from any kind of human emotions or human drives. It's just a model, right? It can exist in different forms. It's not that an AI system, the AI system has to have some goals. We have to assign it some goals, but it doesn't have to have any kind of goals that humans have or the desires that humans have. I wouldn't say that's a human-like intelligence. I would say it's an intelligence that's not human-like, but it could be smarter than a human. So you can have something that's smarter than a human, but not human-like at all. It might be really good at physics and mathematics, but have clueless about romance because it doesn't have any concept of what love is. And I think that's what is really, really smart machines that we won't think of them like human-like at all. They're not going to be our buddies sitting around chatting, over some brewskis or something.
Awesome. All right. Professor Ricardo Goodwin from our School of Electrical Engineering. I was wondering how other theories like William Calvin's the cerebral code theory and Gerald Edelman's neuronal group selection would be compatible with the view you are proposing. Both of them talk about neuronal columns and how they interact. Would you like to chime in a little bit about this? I almost don't want to, but you asked me. I became familiar with Edelman's work early on. When Mountcastle wrote his first treatise about the cortical column, it was in a small book that had 2 monographs in it, about 100 pages. The first one was by Edelman, the second one was by Mountcastle. So that's when I first got exposed to Edelman and his group selective theory of intelligence and followed his work. I don't want to be too blunt about it. I think he was completely wrong. I just felt it was like, I don't even compare. I don't want to, it's like, there's, and of course, that sounds, maybe I'm full of myself or something. I don't know, but it just didn't match the neuroscience. It didn't match the logic of the kind of things I was talking about. And I went and spoke to him about it and I tried to dig into it deeper and I just couldn't get anywhere. The one by Calvin is a bit more relevant, perhaps, and I have read that work. I've thought about it, but it was many years ago, and I have to apologize. I'm not up on it anymore, so I can't speak about it in detail. I have a way of sort of erasing out of my brain things that aren't useful, and I didn't find it useful, so I'll just have to leave it at that. I don't want to diss these people; they're all really smart, but I'm trying to compare these theories to other theories. I look at them, can I learn from them? And if not, I don't spend time on them anymore. All right, no problem. This one is from my student, Jin Yang. Thank you for the awesome presentation. I'm wondering when the brain reacts to pain, for instance, is it part of the modeling of the brain? This seems not to be learned, but an ability, instinct that we are born with.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned there's all these reflex subcortical, right? There's tons of them. If you touch something hot, your spinal cord directs your arm to retract. The old parts of the brain will reorient your body to look at the thing that you just felt. This all happens without the cortex. The cortex sort of says, "Oh, look what happened! Oops! I guess I touched something hot." It's after the fact. So these kind of reflex behaviors are built into the system. And in fact, I didn't say this right now. When the cortex controls behavior, it never does so directly. It has none of the neurons in the cortex directly control muscles. They always project to some part of the brain that controls behavior. So the cortex is like sitting on top of this horse, trying to get the horse to do what it wants, right? It's like saying, okay, I want you to go this way, I want you to go that way. And the horse has its own behaviors, the horse does its own thing, and sometimes it listens to you and sometimes it doesn't. So you will say, I don't want, don't do this. The old brain says, I'm going to do it anyway. Screw you. So those, and I think when we build intelligent machines, so my point of pointing this out, if we build machines built on neocortical principles, they are going to have to be on some embodiment that has behaviors already, and that it's going to learn to control those behaviors. Those behaviors could be very simple, they're very primitive, they don't have to do with pain, they don't have to do with reflection, so you could do that. The point is the old brain has a set of behaviors and the cortex just tries to string them together in new ways to achieve results that it wants. And I believe that will be the architecture for AI based on these principles. So we'll have to have equivalence in AI systems.
Very good. This one from my colleague, Rickson Mesquita from the Institute of Physics. Thanks for the great talk. To me, one of the most striking features of the brain is its complexity, meaning that one cannot get the whole function from its basic units. That would require nonlinear integration among the units of the brain. Does this theory consider nonlinear integration among this, besides the sparsity?
Well, let's break that into two parts. The idea that it's so complex, we just can't, figure out how it works from the parts. But one of the beauties of Mountcastle's proposal is that you don't have to figure out how everything works. You just have to figure out how cortical, how they talk to each other. And that's 90% of it from terms of the neocortex. And so that made our problem much, much simpler. We don't have to understand exactly what's going on in this region, that region, this region. You asked earlier about high-level concepts. Well, if Mountcastle is right and I'm right, then I say, okay, I don't really know exactly how these high-level concepts are going to be done, but I don't need to know them right now too. My cat probably doesn't do that, doesn't do math, or the rat's not thinking about exoplanets or something like that. But I can how column works, and later I can deal with the same mechanism is going to work, and I'll deal with it later. So it allows us to decompose the problem very nicely, and that was always been my belief, and it's turned out to be true so far. So as far as I know, I'm very happy with that. So I don't agree with the original premise that you really can't figure it out. Yes, it's extremely complex, but it's made of 150,000 elements that are almost identical, and even really complex, but I can figure those out. And then the issue about nonlinear integration, I'm going to pass on that one. It's
no problem. I now have a question from my colleague Marco Shida from the School of Educational Physics, Physical Education, Exercises. Dr. Hawkins, congratulations for the presentation. How is the behavior of cortical columns in aging process, like in dementia? And how do you think AI can help older adults, in your opinion?
Well, I wish I had more to say about this. First of all, we study how a healthy brain works, right? That's our goal. Our goal is what's going on? How does it perform? Neurodegeneration and neural diseases is a very broad field. Some of it has to do with information processing problems like schizophrenia, which might be more related to our theories. And then there's neural degeneration that occurs just because so on. And I can't really speak about that because that's a different type of problem that we don't deal with. I think a more interesting question, and I'm going to broaden it out, which is how can AI help us in this regard? That's a really interesting question, and I don't think there's a simple answer. I'm going to give you a couple of different flavors. First of all, a theory of the brain should help us in numerous ways. It should help us understand how to better educate our children. Education, today we educate our kids without any foundational theories about what learning is and how knowledge is stored. It should help us with psychology and psychological problems, because there too we have a field which is really not based on detailed foundational theories about brain function, but they should benefit from that. And some neural diseases are like that too. So in general, I think brain theory can help us in a lot of areas. Now, as we get older, I'm not sure we can overcome this, at least not do that. There are a lot of people who feel we should be able to upload our brains into a computer. Therefore, even if we die, that's okay. Or maybe we'll do neural implants like Neuralink, Elon Musk's company. I'm less positive about those attitudes. In fact, I have a chapter in my book about those two technologies, those two ideas. And it's less that I think it's not physically possible, although it's going to be very, very, very. It's more that I don't think we would actually like the results. You wouldn't really like what happens if you uploaded your brain. And I make the argument for that. There's other ways we can. In fact, the last third of my book is all about how to think about humanity in the context of intelligence and what our goals should be, about thinking about our future. I don't want to give, it's a lot to talk about. I'm broadening the question much beyond where the original question went, but I think it's touching on a broad area of topics about how do we take advantage of brain theory and AI and improve the human condition, and in what areas can we do that? And I think about that a lot, and I wrote about it a lot.
Very good. Two last questions. One, how do you see consciousness related to this theory?
Yeah. Again, I'm not plugging my book really, but I did write a chapter on it because it does scientific papers and people like to know about it. So I wrote about this. There's a wide spectrum of beliefs about consciousness. There are people who believe in panpsychism consciousness, which is like, everything in the world is conscious, a rock, and there's smart people who believe this. And there's other people. I'm on the other end of the spectrum. I don't think consciousness is anything really super special, and I make the argument for that. I walk through a series of to make the case that consciousness is really a type of memory. It's our ability to store and recall the states of our thinking. So the brain has a state at any point in time, and what you're thinking about, what you saw. If you could form no memories of that, you would be oblivious to anything you just did. It'd be like you're living in a dream. There's no memory of what you did a second ago or 2 seconds ago or an hour ago. And what consciousness comes about is because we're able to replay the stuff we were just thinking. Just literally, we replay these memories right in real time, so you can say, oh yeah, I was doing this, I'm doing that. I'm in this room because I thought I had to do that. And that this is actually the gist of consciousness. There's a second part of consciousness, which is called qualia, which is really interesting about why do things feel like they do? Why does green feel different than red, or why does sound feel different than touch? And I take a stab at that one too, but that's a harder question to answer. I think that's a bit more mystery to me.
Very good. Last one. This is like, you can, if you want to, do not need to answer that. So with all the experience that you have, do you believe in the singularity? And if not, what are we missing to achieve like a better AIs?
Well, okay, better AI and singularity are not the same.
Yes.
Right. So I'm not a believer in the singularity. I think it's a flawed idea. Okay. So the idea that, there's some idea that one version of the singularity is that, we make machines that are intelligent and they build intelligent machines that are more intelligent and they build intelligent machines. And all of a sudden we have these machines that are so intelligent that we can't understand them. Well, that's not how intelligence works. Intelligence requires learning, and learning requires interacting with the world. It's not like you can build a machine, all of a sudden it'll know what's going on the other side of the galaxy. It's just not going to happen. It's just until that machine goes there or senses it or does something. So this idea that we'll have a runaway explosion of intelligence, I think is happen. Can we build machines that are 1,000 times smarter than humans? Yeah, but it's not going to be a singularity. It's going to be like, Moore's law. It'll be kind of like we're building and doing and doing and doing and doing. So I think we can eliminate that. But I do think maybe we should end on this. I think today's AI is pretty impressive. They do a lot of great things. People are doing a lot of stuff with them, but I don't think it's where we're going to end up. I think it's a technology base it probably won't go away, but it's not going to be the ultimate flavors of AI. There's just too much wrong with it. They're brittle. They don't generalize. They're expensive. They're hard to train. It's just all these things that people know about. And the solution to this is, I believe, sensory motor learning and a distributed modeling system like the brain. And so I believe that's going to be the focus or the locus of AI at some point in the future. And I think that future is going to be, it's going to come with risks, no doubt about it. And new technology that's really powerful will come with risks. I don't think they're existential risks. I don't think we're going to kill ourselves or, these machines are going to take over or anything like that. But they can be abused. And we have to worry about that. But I think that the advantages to humanity are going to be amazing. It's just going to revolutionize, what it means to be a human. I'll leave you with this one last thought, right? Humans are two things. We are biological animals. And in that regard, we're not very unique, right? We're just like, we're not very good flyers. We don't swim, we're not fast, we're not strong. We're just okay. But we have this brain, and that's what makes us unique. And we need to embrace that. That's the thing. What it means to be human is not our biology and not our genetic offspring. It's our intelligent offspring and our preservation of knowledge as opposed to preservation of our genes. And I'm not saying we should doom humanity. I'm just pointing out that when we think about humanity, we should think about intelligence and knowledge as what makes us unique. And intelligent machines are going to be a huge part of that, both accelerating and creating more knowledge and also helping us preserve it. Again, I make the arguments for this in the latter part of my book. So,
very good. Jeff, thank you for the amazing discussions and for the presentation. I'm sure that everybody here loved it. Thank you for your time, and I hope to have the chance to talk to you in person, like soon after this pandemic's craziness.
Maybe that would be great. That would be really great. So thank you for inviting me, Anderson, and thank you everyone for their questions. Everyone's questions were great.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna sign off then.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye now.
Everybody else, thank you for joining today. I apologize for not being able to go over all of the questions because we don't have the time, but it was awesome. So thank you for joining. And in February, we have more. I'll keep you posted. Thank you. Bye-bye.